Hello and welcome to today's lecture on professional values and objectives, using principles to guide ethical judgment. This lecture will roughly follow Rowson's Chapter 3. Let's first talk about the nature of ethical obligation. Now, we've mentioned in previous lectures that ethics involves rule following, and in our discussion of ethics codes, it seemed as though the primary ethical obligation, or the nature of ethical obligations, is to follow rules that are clearly stated. But today I want to talk to you about some of the limitations of understanding ethics as a matter of rule following, and propose instead that we understand ethics in relation to principles rather than rules. Now, one of the nice things about thinking about ethical obligation as a matter of rule following is that rules tend to be precise, clearly identified, and they allow us to prioritize actions according to whatever values it is that we stipulate. So rules provide a nice guidance for action. For example, the rule, no diving in the shallow end in a public pool area, clearly indicates the behavior that is prohibited. And if we follow that rule, generally people will be safe and they'll have a good time in the pool. So they provide clear guidance for action. And they also thereby help us to be predictable about the actions that we should expect others to engage in. So if we have clearly stipulated rules and people follow those rules, then people's actions are nice and predictable. And they also allow for a high degree actually, of consistency between cases and between moral agents. So if we have a set of rules and everybody follows the rules in the cases to which they apply, then we get a nice level of ethical consistency between those cases and between those moral agents, the people who are conducting the actions in question. However, rule following is problematic for a few reasons. First, it reduces ethics to obedience. So what ethical obligation is becomes a question of obedience. Just follow the rules, obey the rules, do what the rules stipulate. And so what we lose is a degree of agency, of moral responsibility, of decision-making, of deliberation, and of judgment. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. Not all rules are precise, clear, and prioritized. There are some rules that are ambiguous. No diving in the shallow end sounds nice and clear, but what exactly is the shallow end? Most public pools have a gradation of depth. Where does the shallow end stop? And where does the rule then apply? So it's not necessarily as clear as it seems. And so this degree of ambiguity requires the individual agent to then interpret what the rule means, how it applies, the priority with regard to other competing rules, the scope of the rule, that is, over what series of cases or situations does the rule apply, and whether or not there might be some exceptions to the rule. And if there's that degree of interpretation that's required even in simple rule following, then that indicates that ethics can't merely be a question of following rules. We could, of course, try to clarify rules to make them more and more precise so that we eliminate those ambiguities, and then the challenge for the individual is simply to follow all of those highly clarified and detailed rules to the degree stipulated, and then they won't have to exercise any discretion or interpretation or judgment. However, with the complexity of moral circumstances we find ourselves in, it becomes very difficult to understand how it could be possible to stipulate a sufficient set or a complete set of rules to cover every instance and every case and every exception. So instead, it might be better if we think about ethical obligation with regard to judgment. And so ethical obligation as the exercise of responsibilities, primary among which is the responsibility to judge carefully and attentively. So we have two possible alternatives to the rule-following structure. One is what Rowson identifies as the existential position, and that is the view that, well, the only true way of being ethical is to follow independent values values that only the authentic agent establishes for him or herself from scratch. So any values that we might have from our culture, from society, from our parents, from our faith, from our roles, from our professions, we just scrap all of those, throw them out, and start from scratch. However, it's difficult to understand how exactly that is possible. If we don't already have a set of values, then it makes starting from scratch very difficult. So it's not necessarily the case that we would think that cruelty should be prevented if we don't already have a sense of cruelty being worse than the alternative. So if we don't already have a sense of what is better or worse, good or bad, then it's difficult to understand how we could articulate a from-scratch set of values in this sort of authentic existential mode. Instead, we can take a look at what some other philosophers have suggested. For example, Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher from the 17 and early 1800s, and he proposed that ethical judgment is really what we need to exercise. So it's quite plausible to accept that we have values from a variety of sources, and what ethical judgment then is about is exercising our capacity for reason to critically evaluate and assess those different values for what they can contribute to our ability to act autonomously. So on this view, morality is understood as a constraint which an individual freely imposes on him or herself through the exercise of reason, with the attempt to make him or herself more free. And so what we have then is the idea that ethically worthy actions are actions that are the result of the exercise of autonomy, of an individual choosing for herself from a variety of values, which are the values that should motivate her actions. And that the primary motivation is to do right and to reduce wrong. Now, autonomous action can be compared with heteronymous action. Heteronymous action is motivated by a concern for something external to the rational, fully free individual. So, for example, if I follow the dictates of my religion decrees that I ought to be kind to others, be kind to strangers, for example, out of respect for God. Well, if I decide that that's also an ethical requirement, then my motivation is not to be kind to others for the value of kindness, but to be kind to others out of a sense of duty to God, or out of my obedience to divine will. And on this view, that would be an example of heteronymous action. I'm not motivated in and of myself with regard to the value of the action in place, but I'm motivated out of a sense of duty to God or obligation to follow the divine will. There are other ways we can be heteronymous. That is, we can simply be following the orders of our superiors. And so if I undertake something because my boss has ordered me to do so, or directed me to do so, or my supervisor has said that I must do it, and I do it because my supervisor told me to do it, or because my boss ordered me to do it, then I'm not acting as an autonomous being. I'm acting under the direction of someone else. And actually, in Kantian terms, I would be acting under the direction of some other rational will, that is, the rational will of my boss. And so I'm merely operating as a tool or instrument of his or her will, rather than acting according to my own will and my own determination of what's right. We see this example in the military context. If you are familiar at all with the Nuremberg trials after World War II, this was famously used as a defense for some of the heinous war crimes that Nazis and German soldiers undertook, and the defense seemed consistently to be, well, I was just following orders. I shipped these trainloads of people off to extermination camps because I was ordered to do so. I pulled the lever to turn on the gas in the gas chamber to kill these hundreds of people because I was ordered to. I wasn't doing it, I was merely following orders. And when you claim to be following orders, then you're claiming not to be an autonomous agent. You're claiming that you're simply an instrument of someone else's will, of someone else's dictate. And on this view of ethics and on this view of the nature of ethical obligation, you are failing as a moral agent. You are ethically failing because the obligation you have and the primary responsibility you have on this view is to identify ethical values and principles that are worth pursuing. You identify them, and they're values that are worth your pursuing them. And then you apply them to the particular situations to determine the right action. A heteronymous individual is failing in these two responsibilities. So that would, as it was decreed in the Nuremberg trials, that's no defense. So the defense of I was just following orders is actually a defense that indicates you failed as a moral agent. So on this view then of the nature of ethical obligation, what we have is this view of the individual as exercising his or her own ethical judgment, exercising her capacity for reason, examining the various values that are available to her from society, from social roles, from an ethics code, from various sources, and determining which of those values are values worth pursuing, and then applying them to particular cases and situations in order to determine how she should act. And this requires, of course, that the professionals and the public servants involved can be trusted to act in the spirit of ethical values and toward the objectives of their professions. And the article that I have as a supplemental reading by Brian on cultivating a culture of trust is really key to this. So if you're interested in this a little bit more, this idea of cultivating a culture of trust among professionals and public servants with regard to each other, to provide the context in which individuals exercise this kind of moral judgment, then please read that Brian article. All right, so let's talk about moral judgment then. As I've said, there are diverse sources of value. There are socially available values. There are values that we find through social roles and their purposes. There are professional ideals of best practices and other sources of value. Moral judgment then requires that we reflect on those values that are available to us, and we assess the relevance of a particular value to a particular case. And so we determine which values are involved in a particular case. And so we look at all those available and we find those which are best suited to this case. And then we consider the relative importance of these values and rank their priority. So if we have a case where there's a question both of a potential harm to an individual and of a question of their privacy, if we act to prevent the particular harm, that might mean we have to jeopardize some element of the individual's privacy. These are two important values. We have to determine which of these values is more important. Is privacy more important in this case than preventing the harm, or is preventing the harm more important than preserving the privacy? So we would have to exercise judgment regarding the relative importance of these values to the particular case, and then interpret these values in light of the relevant factors of this case. What do the values mean to the individual at stake, to the client, to the profession, to others in relation, whoever would be affected by my decision, and so forth. So I have to judge how these values play out and what actions they would require in light of relevant factors such as those. And then I render a judgment. So I identify diverse sources of value, I reflect on the values that are available, and then I render a judgment. And what this does then, this way of understanding moral reasoning as opposed to simply rule following, is we establish a connection between values, principles, and actions. For example, we have some particular value, privacy, expressed in the ethical principle we ought to respect individuals' autonomy and integrity, and privacy would be part of autonomy and integrity of the individual, and that requires that I act to respect their privacy and not disclose more than I need to in this particular case, whatever the case might be. So I have a connection now between values, principles, and actions in particular situations. And this then would hopefully result in a decision about what ought to be done that is both rational, that is, it can be rationally defended and justified, and it is objective, that is, it is something that can be understood and accepted by anyone, not simply someone with my particular viewpoint or my particular experience or my particular knowledge set, but it would be a decision that would be understandable to anyone to whom I would articulate it. Okay, let's take a look at professional objectives and what these have to do with establishing values. So for every profession or social role, there's a fundamental objective, that is, what it is that it aims to achieve. And this should, in large part, capture the social purpose of the profession or the role, and we've talked about the purposes of roles in previous lectures. This objective also is that on the basis of which expectations by the public and by peers, by fellow colleague professionals, colleague public servants, have of the role holder, of the professional who's exercising judgment in this particular case. So the fundamental objective of a profession or a social role expresses the aim of the profession, captures its social purpose, and is the basis on which expectations are formed. There's an overarching objective across all professions and across all areas of the public service, and this overarching objective is to promote the well-being of individuals and of society. Now, when I say it's an overarching objective, what I mean is that within each particular profession or each branch of the public service, there might be particular objectives. And we'll take a look at some of those in the next slide. But those particular objectives all fall under a sort of umbrella objective of promoting the well-being of individuals and of society. And we'll talk about well-being a little bit more in the next lecture. This overarching objective unifies the professions, gives them a sort of common core or common element that cuts across all of them. And it also is what entails and requires professionals and role holders to value the objectives, the particular objectives of each of the other professions and roles. So some examples of valuing professional roles, here are some. You can probably think of some more. Healthcare professionals must value people's health and the relief of suffering. Police must value public order and people's ability to live in safe communities. Engineers and architects must value people's living in pleasing and safely built environments. Police, court officials, lawyers must value people's having the protection of the laws, and so forth. So you can see that if we identify these sort of broad objectives appropriate to each particular profession or area of the public service, we can see that there's something common that cuts through them, and that common element is that overarching objective of ensuring people's well-being, both as individuals and as a society, a community. So what we get then is this view that professionals have this overarching obligation to value all objectives, all of those other professionals and other public service with whom they come in contact and with whom they conduct their affairs. So the social value of a diversified set of specialized roles and professions is achieved by each understanding their objectives together with the others. So the particular objective of a police officer is related to the particular objective of nurses, of firefighters, of teachers, and so forth. And seeing that this is something that unites and is common across all the professions and all the branches of the public service. So then, with this overarching objective of fostering people's well-being, all the professions have an obligation to value people's well-being in all the various contexts in which they come across. People's well-being then would be achieved by having a safe, healthy, prosperous community where each has the opportunity for education, is protected by laws, etc., etc., etc. And so you can see then in a diverse and complex society an individual and the society's well-being is achieved by having all of the diverse professions working together toward that same overarching objective in the particular ways that they work on that objective, in the particular ways that their profession identifies the specific objectives of the profession. And so then we all have an obligation to value the objectives of each and every other profession. Now, how do we get principles? Well, from the foundational objectives of professional and public service roles, we get 4 action guiding, that is normative, principles. And by normative, I don't mean normative in the sociological sense, that is, this is the norm, this is the average, this is the standard that everybody engages in. Here we use the term normative in an ethical sense, and normative here means action guiding. It is prescriptive, that is, it prescribes action that achieves certain values or certain principles. So in that sense of normative, we can specify by looking across the various foundational objectives of professional and public service roles 4 guiding principles. And these are the 4 guiding principles that will be the focal point of the remainder of the semester. So just briefly here we're introducing them. And that is, first, to promote the best results. Second, to treat people fairly and justly. Third, to respect individual autonomy. And fourth, to act with integrity. The overarching objective of all professions and public service branches then is to promote the well-being of individuals in society, and to do so by following those 4 principles, by using those 4 principles to structure and guide their ethical judgment in particular cases with regard to particular individuals and clients. Okay, wrapping up. Being ethical then requires more than merely following rules. Ethical conduct is too much like simple obedience to rules on the view that obligation is determined by rule following, and we cannot specify enough rules to cover all the situations. Those are the 2 major problems with understanding obligation as rule following. And so instead, we're going to inspire each other and challenge each other to engage in rational judgment and the exercise of what I'm calling practical wisdom, identifying values from the various objectives of professions and public services, and from those values identifying core principles, and recognizing that those principles allow for a broad assessment of right action within specific particular cases. We've identified 4 basic principles, which we'll explore in later lectures: seeking the best results, treating people fairly and justly, respecting individuals' autonomy, and conducting oneself with integrity. And finally, these principles derive from an assessment of the objectives of professional public service roles, and combined with the overarching principle to promote people's well-being. All right, now here are some questions to think about. Some of these challenge you to engage with your profession of choice and think about how you can apply what you've just learned in this lecture to these situations. Thank you very much.